So I wanted to share this time one of my very own experiences with EMDR. The first, actually. Both to really illustrate the process for anyone who's curious. And I also wanted to share this one because I think it's a really lovely example, clinically speaking. Like it's kind of a textbook EMDR story, nicely illustrating some of the concepts. And so the story of this one is that when I was younger, my husband was diagnosed with cancer. And so the target memory was being in the doctor's office with him when they did a certain kind of biopsy to realize that the cancer had already spread to his lymph nodes, which was really the moment that the whole nightmare started. So that was the target memory, being in the appointment with him. And to set up an EMDR target, we often will go to the worst part of the experience and ask if there's an image associated with it. We're looking for the emotions, the body sensations, any negative cognitions or beliefs about yourself in that moment. So in this example, the worst moment was, of course, hearing it come out of the doctor's mouth. Yes, we did find the cancer in the lymph nodes. And the image was just a memory of the layout of the room, the doctor here, my husband there, and just kind of looking at all of them. The negative cognition, it was hard to pinpoint for myself as the client, and so this was good learning for me as a clinician. Sometimes it is. We can't just easily identify what's the negative belief about ourselves or about the situation there. Now I can, kind of looking back, understand it, that kind of the challenge, the awful icing on top of the cake in that situation was how helpless I felt. So the negative cognition, I guess technically in a textbook kind of way, would be I'm helpless. I didn't experience it in that kind of simple way. Of course, it felt more just like an internal screaming, which I think honestly that's more how the negative cognitions, how we experience them, just more of like a felt sense of like, ah! We're not up here thinking, I feel so helpless. I'm helpless in this scenario. I'm not safe. It's deeper. So it's kind of a translating process, putting words onto it. So anyway, now I can look back and realize, okay, the negative cognition was, I'm helpless. And the therapist doing this with me, she asked, what would you prefer to believe? What would be the positive cognition that we want to install instead? I remember with EMDR, the process, big picture, 1, reduce the distress, 2, install a positive cognition or belief instead. So what do we want to believe in this scenario? Well, oftentimes just the reverse of the negative cognition. So in this case, I'm not helpless, or translated into like human language, we're gonna get through this, there's things we can do, we'll make it. Things like that. The emotions associated with this memory as we began were basically almost sheer terror, basically wordless internal screaming, fear. Then we ask for the intensity of distress, subjective units of distress, or SUD, to use the acronym, from 0 to 10. And at the time, I think my distress level was about a 7 or 8, recalling that moment. Physical sensations experiencing. I remember definitely nausea, basically. Nausea, tightness in the chest, just, a lot of like, almost in a literal way wanting to throw up, except it was an emotional throwing up, but just like I reject this completely, but physically. Okay, so those were the beginning conditions for this memory, the initial train station that we're setting off from to remember our train metaphor. And then, okay, so then off we go. The therapist, we did eye movements together, and for the first couple sets, the first few train stations on the journey, the distress level remained about the same. I remember experiencing just different pieces of the memory. Like, basically, the first segment, I think I remember starting at the beginning of the memory, like driving up to the appointment, making small talk with the doctor, checking in, and then waiting for the biopsy to happen. So that was kind of the first couple chunks, and still really experiencing a lot of distress, a lot of the same emotions and physical reactions throughout for maybe 3 or 4 different sets, different passes of eye movements. And then there was a shift during one segment. I remember my perspective changing from being like first person in the memory to suddenly feeling a bit more distance, like as though now I were a benevolent narrator looking back on that moment and kind of seeing myself and my husband from a more detached stance, and just having a lot of sadness for it. And having a couple sets of deep sadness, like, oh my gosh, like, that was such a frightening moment. That was really the start of a terrible journey for me and him. And just kind of a softer, so we went from terror and then when that kind of mellowed out, it was more of a softness and sadness and grief and just knowing what was to come after that moment. A lot of struggle to come after that moment, but with more of a detached stance. And then another few passes of that, and then I really reached the point where, yeah, the distress was gone. The distress was no longer there. Obviously the moment happened, I could still remember it, but there was more of that sense of detachment, more of the sense of like, okay, yeah, that moment, that was the start of the journey. Things really got rocky after that, but ultimately it's okay. And so that would be now the first arc of EMDR. The distress has dropped. So now the therapist, we're going to look together at the cognitions, the negative or positive beliefs about that scenario. So for me, if you'll remember, I'm helpless was kind of the negative cognition. So now that the distress is gone, we're going to try to install more of the positive belief instead. Something along the lines of, we can do this. And so in the installation phase, the therapist asked me like, okay, well, how true does that feel for you in that memory? And there had already been kind of organically some improvement in there, so that it felt about halfway true. Like, I guess, kind of. We literally did survive that moment. Just so you guys know, the validity of positive cognition, validity of cognition, VOC, to use our acronym. For some reason, we measure that on a 7-point scale from 0 to 7, where 0 is not true at all and 7 is extremely true. We just do. So initially when we started, for me, that felt about halfway through, like, okay, 3 or 4, we can do this. Sure, kind of. And then as we kept going, it was really cool. In this next set, kind of the thought that I had was, well, you know, like I still don't know if he can survive this, if he will survive this. At that point in time, it wasn't clear yet. So I don't know if he can, but if there's anybody who can help him do it, it's the team of doctors that he has. I have a lot of faith in his doctors. And so then that was interesting. After that round, the VOC, the validity of the belief, we can do this, that felt 1 tick more true. So now we're at like I don't know, 4-ish, 4.5-ish. In the next round, I was, the insight was kind of remembering like, oh yeah, you know, I was the one who drove him to those appointments. And that helped actually bring up the validity of cognition too, kind of remembering, oh, that's right, like, it may not feel like there's a lot that I can do here. I may feel helpless, but you know what? I can drive a car, I can get him to the doctors. I can do something. So that helped a little bit. And then the final round, the insight, I remember like, oh, that's right, like this team of doctors that I have so much faith in, I'm actually the one who found them and set up these appointments and drove him there. And so that really helped kind of cement that positive belief, like, okay, this is still a really tough situation, but I'm not helpless here. I do have agency. There's things that I can do. I can interact with this situation in some sort of positive way. I'm not just a helpless pawn in this scenario. I can act, I can do things. And so at that point, that was kind of when we knew that we'd reached the end of the EMDR journey for that one. My distress was minimal. I looked back with some mild sadness, but it felt okay. I looked back on it with a sense of agency. I can do things. I did my best. I'm responding in this situation rather than helplessness. And so I love that story. It's very dear to my heart, both because, well, one, for the kind of moment that it was, and two, because that was my first ever experience with EMDR, and three, I just think it's neat how nicely it kind of illustrates the different phases of an EMDR session. So I hope you guys enjoyed hearing that. Please post any comments or questions below, and thanks for tuning in.